damages because of lawsuits over the violence there. It is a gang-run prison, extremely violent. And yet, in the context of all of that, of those terrifying conditions, there is a thriving restorative justice program run by a pastor who himself was a former prisoner at Holsmore Prison and represents a legacy in South Africa of restorative justice, of talking about what it means to take responsibility for your actions, to address the fact that you have caused harm. In this particular program, on the last day, the prisoners have an opportunity to confront the people they've harmed and say, I'm sorry, to take ownership for what they've done, to apologize to their family members and reconcile with their family members, because as we know, incarceration tears families apart in ways that are often irreparable. And I think one of the most profound experiences or learning experiences that I had in the context of being a facilitator of this workshop in South Africa was rethinking some of the language that we use when we talk about incarceration. So we often talk about, and it's been mentioned already today, we talk about second chances. I myself, as director of the Prison to College Pipeline, we are beneficiaries of a wonderful program, a government program in the U.S. called the Second Chance Pell Act that provides financial assistance to incarcerated students. I'll talk more about that tomorrow. But in many ways, second chances is not quite right. It's actually, in prisons that I've been in everywhere in the world, more like a first chance. And that is because we need to recognize that so many people in prison, the overwhelming majority of the prison population, certainly in the US where I work, where there is a legacy of racial discrimination in our criminal justice system, of over-incarcerated populations, whether it's individuals who come from a particular racial and ethnic background, as in the US. There are actually more blacks under criminal supervision today, more African Americans under criminal supervision today in the US than there were slaves at the height of slavery in 1850. In South Africa, the prison population is overwhelmingly black and colored, as you can see from this picture. In many countries I've been in around the world, Uganda, for instance, which I'll get to in a moment, the prison population is overwhelmingly poor. So we're talking about a particular group that has been targeted and criminalized and over-incarcerated. These are individuals who, given the legacy of inequality, given the legacy of systemic poverty, systemic racism in some countries, including my own, never had an opportunity at a first chance. And so instead of talking about second chances, quite often we're talking about first chances. Certainly, this is especially true in the context of South Africa, where the legacy of institutional racism runs deeper than perhaps anywhere else on earth. But I've also seen it played out in various forms, as I'll get to, around the world. The idea that there is a clear distinction as well between a victim and an offender, that all the people in prison are offenders and others who are harmed by them are victims, is also, I think, an artificial binary and too simplistic for thinking about what prisons are really about. Because the bulk of people in prisons, and I think about my own students in the Prison to College Pipeline in this regard, the bulk of them have committed wrongs, but they've also been wronged. They've been wronged in the context of families that are rife with addiction and crime and other forms of harm. They have been harmed by governments that have allowed for racial discrimination and systemic poverty and not given them the opportunities in the first place, that instead of actually giving them opportunities is quite often funneling them into prisons and creating, again, a direct line between poverty, discrimination, and access to prisons. And so I think it's important to unseat some of these very simple ideas about who's victim and who is offender and first chances and second chances, and recognize who the people in our prisons are, how little opportunity they've been given at things like education, jobs, access to opportunities overall. And that deeply shapes how we think about prisons and what they are meant to do. So shifting from there, I moved on, next slide please, to look a little more specifically at something that we talk quite a bit about in this conference, which is this idea of rehabilitation. And I wanted to think about what we mean when we talk about rehabilitation. And I will say that based on what I just said, rehabilitation is also a term that I find problematic because rehabilitation implies that you were habilitated in the first place. And in fact, populations in prisons around the world, including the young men in this prison, this is Luzira prison in Kampala, Uganda, a prison that was built for 500 and houses 6,000 men, women, children, and death row prisoners. These are individuals who come from poor backgrounds, who were given little access to opportunity in a country shaped by colonial hierarchies, and therefore in many respects were conditioned to go to prison. And then when they were in prison, they could not afford the bribe to get them out. And so I am very aware of that when I talk about their conditions of quote-unquote rehabilitation. But that said, there are certain things that are certainly capable. I think we're all in the business of trying to make people who've done harm better people. How do we shape consciousness? How do we bring people to the point of consciousness? How do we make them think about what they've done and their place in the world and how to be greater human beings? And one of those is through the arts. And so I spent some time here in Uganda, and then next slide, in Jamaica, in looking at the role of the arts and what it does to people. This is General Penitentiary in Kingston, Jamaica. It's a prison, again, that was built for about 400 and houses almost 2,000. And individuals are in their cells for 22 hours a day. There are no toilets in their cells. They are sleeping standing up. Conditions are quite extreme. In both of these prisons, however, there's a powerful arts program at play. In Jamaica, it's a music program, a reggae music program, and in Uganda, it's a creative writing program that I collaborated with a local NGO to start. And I think the great takeaway from that is that as an English professor, I rarely get to teach English anymore because I'm so often involved in criminal justice issues, but I certainly believe I teach writing in the prison in the US, in New York, every fall semester from September to December. I believe in the power of the arts to change consciousness, to change behavior, to get people to think differently about themselves, their agency, their whole identities. The arts is enormously powerful. Is it enough to solve a crisis as exists in Uganda and Jamaica? No. But it makes a tremendous impact, although I see it as sort of a band-aid as long as we're addressing the larger systemic issues that surround the role of the arts. The interesting thing about this photograph, actually, which highlights sort of the main theme of my book in many respects, is that if I showed you this photograph and I asked you to identify where is this prison, what country is it in, I doubt anyone would be able to choose Jamaica. And that is because prisons around the world, and this is quite a remarkable thing to see as I've traveled for several years now, visiting prisons around the world, they look remarkably alike. And many of them look like that. That is sort of the classic prison look. And that is not an accident. That is because that right there is an American prison model. America invented the modern prison system. We did so in the 19th century. We built the first two modern prisons, one in Pennsylvania and one in New York. And then the rest of the world came to see these modern marvels. They were considered enormously revolutionary. They were considered amazing bouts of technology. And the world came to see them. And much of the world was controlled by a few colonial superpowers at that time. So they then took that model, exported it, and copied it around the world. This is based on Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. It's a prison after which over 300 prisons around the world were modeled. So you see versions of this in Jamaica. Next slide is one more example. This is La Penitenciaria in Santiago, Chile. Versions of this prison exist everywhere. And I think this is enormously rich because when we think about it, countries are so unique. They are so dissimilar. Cultures are so dissimilar. And yet the idea that you could have a one-size-fits-all system of justice, namely prisons, is pervasive. America built this institution, and the rest of the world sort of followed. It was foisted on the rest of the world, primarily through colonialism and then through globalization. And I think that should give us pause, not necessarily to say, let's all blame America, but to think about, what are we doing when we incarcerate? Is this model still relevant? It's a model that was built in one context 2 centuries ago for one particular nation. Is it relevant in my nation anymore? Is it a useful response to crime? Is it a progressive response to crime? Or have we simply cut and pasted this model all over the world as we have architecturally? From Uganda and Jamaica, next slide, I visited your nearby country of Thailand. And I visited specifically the women incarcerated in Thailand, and I was privileged enough to meet the Princess of Thailand, who runs a very powerful program to assist them. And I chose to go to Thailand to specifically focus on women because the incredible thing about this scenario with incarcerated women, I'm sure it's relevant in the prison here and jails here as well, is that almost all women incarcerated around the world have a very similar narrative. And that narrative generally involves drug crimes, partners, usually male partners who somehow got them involved. And it's certainly the case in Thailand, where there are about 25,000 convicted women prisoners, more than 20,000 of them in for drug-related offenses. And in a country where, as I'm sure many people are aware, there was a profound crackdown on meth in 2003, which was turned to a first-class narcotic overnight. And often these women are the sort of foot soldiers in a larger drug trade, and therefore bearing the brunt of it, when in many respects they were victimized on account of gender roles, on account of issues of substance abuse and addiction. And so I think the most important takeaway, and actually in the next slide, you'll see this is another country nearby that I spent time in quite recently, and that's Taiwan, where I had the opportunity to visit several women's prisons there. The narratives that I heard were the same as the women in Thailand, who, by the way, are being given opportunities through the Princess of Thailand at computer education courses, massage training, restaurant training, things that are hugely important in bringing these women back to the community as productive citizens, as able to cope with their own addictions. But I think the most important thing is, of course, number one, that such opportunities are given for individuals to recover from their addictions, their struggles with drugs, and potentially with the drug trade to give them, and to think about drugs as a public health crisis instead of a criminal justice one. We need to look at where they come from, what can be done around them, and how we can overcome them in such a way as to benefit all of society. From Thailand, I visited, next slide, the country, another prison that if I showed you this slide, you probably would not be able to identify exactly where it is. But that is Brazil, Catanduvas, Brazil, and that is a supermax prison where several hundred prisoners are being held in solitary confinement for 22 hours a day for years at a cost of 18 million is the cost of the structure, 120,000 US dollars a year to keep a person incarcerated in those conditions. Supermax prisons, the practice of solitary confinement, is something that exists globally. At least 12 countries have supermaxes, keeping people in solitary. Spending, as Brazil is the fastest rising prison population in the Americas. Fast approach is a great harm to people in it, and does not therefore benefit communities, does not build safer communities overall. It is once again a version of incarceration that was developed in America in the 1980s and then exported to the world. And what I witnessed inside this prison in Brazil whereas men who were quite literally losing their minds in the context of being held for years in isolation. And yet it's a growing practice that we see all around the world. The second to last country that I visited before I wrap up with some summations, next slide please, this is actually Australia. You wouldn't again be able to tell, same model, modeled after Eastern State Penitentiary. And Australia is a country that is remarkably similar to the US in its incarceration practices. Are in private prisons. And overall, private prisons are, again, a global phenomenon. Many countries are following in America's footsteps in privatizing their prison systems. They do not correlate with lower recidivism rates necessarily. They do not correlate with higher levels of programming or rehabilitation. And yet they're a growing practice that's used. 100% of Australia's immigration detection system is privatized. And I think what that asks us to recognize is the way that justice and economics should never be intertwined. That when we talk about justice, we should be talking about a justice that is blind, not only in terms of race and hierarchy, but in terms of economics. And so to mix up these two things in the way that many the fundamental basis of the private prison system does is highly problematic in terms of talking about justice as an overarching ideal. The last two prisons that I spent time in, next slide is another one of your neighbors, Singapore. And in Singapore, what I wanted to specifically focus on is another issue that will come up quite a bit in this conference, this issue of reentry. This issue of what do we give people such when they're in prison, such that when they come home, they are not going to recidivate. They will have access to opportunities. They will be better neighbors, better citizens, not just not commit crime again, but actually come out and contribute to society, contribute to their respective nations, and make the world a better place. And reentry is something I'm deeply invested in on a daily basis. The Prison to College pipeline in New York is very much about utilizing education as the centerpiece of reentry, as is the College Behind Bars program. And I was deeply impressed by some of the reentry work that I saw happening in Singapore. Singapore has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world, and it's around 24%. Singapore finds jobs for 99% of its incarcerated individuals. It also works to keep them in jobs. It provides access to job training while on the inside. And so I think there's no accident that there is a low recidivism rate. The other thing, and that's what this ad on display is, the other thing Singapore does is promote a culture of acceptance and tolerance of former prisoners, of people who've come home from prison. And notice that when I speak about people who've been in prison or who are currently in prison, I don't use language of convicts and prisoners and ex-cons. I speak of formerly incarcerated people or people in prison or people who have been imprisoned because I put the language of humanity first. We need to recognize that these are people and that we cannot allow the stigma to impact them for the rest of their lives. It does not benefit them, it does not benefit us as a society if we truly want to see reintegration. And so this is a part and parcel of the Yellow Ribbon Project in Singapore, which sensitizes the public and especially employers, CEOs, to thinking about how can I fully embrace someone who comes home from prison. To stay out of prison, all he needs is a break. And this is someone going for a job. And so promotion of social inclusion rather than social exclusion, that is not only an act of kindness, but an act that benefits all of us as a society and as a nation. Speaking of kindness, I concluded my journey around the world in a country, next slide please, in a country, yes, that is a prison, believe it or not. That's a prison in Norway. It's quite a famous prison called Bastøy. It's an island. It was actually featured in a number of documentaries. You can see some videos about it on YouTube. It's very famous because it most represents a prison model that I think is the most inspiring of them all, that exists throughout Scandinavia as well as in Germany. In versions of it exist in Australia and Germany and the Netherlands. It's an open prison. And what that means is that there are no walls, both literally and metaphorically. Individuals who are incarcerated there are permitted to come and go and work jobs on the outside, engage in family leave, receive health care on the outside, and truly remain part of their society. I should emphasize that the prisoners inside this prison are not necessarily low-level offenders. They come from all walks of crime, all kinds of backgrounds, because the essence of this model is that these people are going to come home, number one. Number two, they are human beings, just like you and me. Number three, it benefits all of us if they remain connected to communities, connected to jobs, connected to their families, because when they come home, they will fully be able to reintegrate. And number four, it has actually never happened that someone has not come back. So this anxiety around running away, around escaping, has not borne fruit. It has not been a reality in the Norwegian experience. Which is why we're actually seeing versions of this model replicated in places like Costa Rica. In Brazil, there is an open prison. In Jamaica, there is an open prison. Even in places where you might not expect there to be one, because there is so much richness to this model of what happens when we break down these walls and actually create opportunities for integration, reintegration, social integration. I should say that not all prisons in Norway are open. 30% approximately are. But the other thing that is profound about the Norwegian prison system, even in a closed prison where I also visited, is that, number one, the approach to staff training in Norway is quite radically unique. I've never seen anything like this around the world. And in Norway, the Staff Training Academy is a 2-year program, highly competitive, well-paying, socially very well respected. To be a corrections officer is like being an educator, a professor, someone who has an enormous responsibility. And I think the corrections officers in this room can understand what that responsibility is. If you are doing your job as it was designed, you are correcting. And so you are an educator. So Norway pays its corrections officers well, trains them not only in the law, but social work, psychology, philosophy, things that enable a person to really think about what justice is and how it's delivered. And I think it's a great inspiration overall to look at that. To look at Norway. The next slide has an example of actually one more open prison. This is an open prison in Italy, in Tuscany, where the men who are in prison there are making wine and being paid for it and then being employed as winemakers with this company when they return home. Again, another example of how this model can work. And so the ultimate moral of the story for me, as I think about traveling around the world, I continue to do this work. The work that I'm engaged in now is, number one, around being involved with education behind bars in a global context in such exciting settings as this one. I'm hugely inspired by the program here. I think it's a model not only for a national model for the Philippines, but a model for the world of what can be done when a university makes a commitment. And I think the role of education in creating safer communities is immense. I'm not sure there's anything more powerful. But most fundamentally, if there is a takeaway here, it's a few things. Number one, I think when we think about justice, we need to use our radical imagination. And we need to think about the many things that are possible if we think innovatively, if we think creatively, and most of all, if we think past sort of archaic, outdated notions. I often look at recidivism rates around the world, including in the US, which generally hover around 60%, 70%. And I think if any company were run with a failure rate of 60 to 70%, it would be shut down immediately. And yet, too often, we persist in this prison-centered model of justice, despite its lack of success in terms of the numbers. And so, how can we think past that? How can we think about what justice looks like in the 21st century? Does it look like education programs, restorative justice programs, open prisons, all kinds of different policy changes that create safer communities? It is possible to talk about a humane prison system, a humane justice system, but also talk about safe communities, and also talk about keeping people protected from harm in those communities. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. And I think the other great takeaway is that we must think globally about the problem and recognize the commonalities, as I've been trying to draw out, in the problems of criminal justice around the world. I've seen the same legal issues, the same rehabilitation issues, the same prison condition issues play out globally. But at the same time, we must think globally about solutions, which is why I again emphasize that a program like the College Behind Bars program is globally relevant. Innovative solutions are happening all around the world. What we need to do is fix our global attention on them and take lessons from a global context instead of from a singular one, and instead of relying on an easy model, think about ways that we can be innovative, we can be radically innovative, and use the brain power in our respective countries to truly advance the thing that we call justice. So once again, I thank you for being here. I look forward to an incredibly powerful conference today and tomorrow, and I will see you as the day progresses. Thank you.